When it comes to baking bread, fermentation is all about yeast. Yeast is a microscopic fungus consisting of single oval cells that reproduce by budding. It is used as a leavening agent in baking bread, which we'll get into shortly. There are over 1,500 distinct species of yeast and many more strains. However, when we bake bread, we are almost always using Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Commercial baking yeast, whether we're talking about fresh cake yeast, active dry, or instant, are all purified cultures of the same species. They will all go dormant at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and they will all die at 130 degrees Fahrenheit during baking. My recipe calls for flour, yeast, sugar, salt, warm to hot water, and cooking oil. The recipe calls for 2 tablespoons of yeast. Yeast, as mentioned earlier, is a leavening agent and causes the bread to rise and become fluffy. Yeast uses alcohol fermentation to obtain energy from the sugars in flour. Flour is composed mostly of starch, which in turn is composed of molecules of glucose, a simple sugar assembled into long branching chains. The yeast readily devours the glucose in the flour, and because the recipe calls for 5 cups, there is plenty of it. The recipe also calls for 2 teaspoons of sugar. Sugar is made up of sucrose, which is a disaccharide, or double sugar, composed of 1 molecule of glucose linked to 1 molecule of fructose. The glucose in the sugar I added gives the yeast even more stuff to feed on, allowing it to survive and produce very important wastes. We will discuss these wastes later. Another ingredient, warm to hot water, is important because it forms gluten and gives the dough consistency. By hydrating the starch and proteins and dissolving the salt granules in yeast, water is a key factor in the basic formation of dough. Water serves as a solvent or medium for substances like sugar and enzymes that are essential for fermentation. Also, when the bread is baking, water in the dough helps to distribute the heat evenly throughout the bread. The temperature of the water is very important. It is crucial to use warm to hot water because, as a rule, warmer dough will rise faster than colder dough. The next ingredient is a teaspoon of salt. Salt helps to boost the flavors in the bread. Salt also inhibits the yeast and slows the rising process, decreasing the rate at which yeast creates gas wastes. Slowing the rising period gives the gluten in the dough time to strengthen and develop, resulting in better texture and crust. Not using salt could result in excessive fermentation, leading to gassy, sour dough with very poor texture. The final ingredient is cooking oil. I chose to use canola oil. Oil provides lubrication, which improves dough handling, eases dough expansion, and makes it easier to slice the bread once it is done baking. In the bread making process, the yeast undergoes cellular respiration. The yeast starts off respiring aerobically, that is, with oxygen. After the oxygen runs out, anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation, begins, occurring in the absence of oxygen. During both aerobic respiration and fermentation, yeast cells break down glucose molecules within the cell to release energy in a process called glycolysis. Some of this energy is captured and stored in the ATP's high-energy phosphate bonds. The breakdown of glucose also releases carbon atoms, which become available for biosynthetic reactions, enabling the yeast to grow and reproduce by budding. The rest of the carbon ends up in the byproducts of these reactions. The byproducts or wastes include water, carbon dioxide, and an alcohol called ethanol. The carbon dioxide gas that is expelled from the yeast creates air pockets and bubbles in the bread. This causes the bread to rise and makes it light, fluffy, and spongy. Baking kills the yeast and sets these air pockets. The high temperatures during baking also evaporate the ethanol produced during fermentation. During fermentation, components of the food start to change. The amount of oxygen in the dough decreases because the yeast respires aerobically until there is no oxygen left. Once oxygen has been depleted, the yeast respires anaerobically, a process called fermentation. Glucose levels also drop because the yeast devours glucose molecules and breaks them down to release energy and byproducts or wastes. These wastes include carbon dioxide, water, and ethanol. Thus, the carbon dioxide and ethanol levels in the dough increase. Temperature also increases slightly. As dough ferments, heat is generated, raising the dough temperature and accelerating the yeast activity. pH remains stable, however. If you were to make sourdough bread, pH would decrease because sourdough bread is made with lactic acid bacteria. Yes, I was successful in making my bread. I used 2 tablespoons of rapid rise yeast, a fast-acting instant yeast. The glucose in the flour and sugar gave something for the yeast to feed on, while the teaspoon of salt not only boosted flavor but served as a fermentation retardant, preventing excessive fermentation. The bread rose perfectly, and I was left with 2 soft, fluffy loaves with a crisp crust. Although the loaves turned out tasty, one of the loaves looked a little deformed. I placed it in the pan and did not smooth out the wrinkles beforehand, assuming that all of the kinks and imperfections would smooth themselves out as the bread expanded. This was not the case, and I was left with a slightly deformed but tasty loaf. If I were to redo this, I would smooth out all the imperfections before placing the loaf in the oven. However, this is merely a cosmetic issue and is not a big deal.